You mentioned earlier China and India competing and in many forums, and one of those being the United Nations. Do you feel that the United Nations needs to be reformed? And there's also been talk about India, possibly becoming a member of the UN Security Council. Mm-hmm. And I personally feel the UN Security Council absolutely needs to be reformed. So maybe you could speak a little bit about how India's membership in that would change that body.
So I'm speaking purely as my personal views on this, but I've long felt that the UN, even 20 years ago, the UN needed to be reformed. Yeah. That it was no longer fulfilling the purpose that it was set out to fulfill after World War II. It's not just because of its composition, although that is certainly part of it, but also its agenda, its the lack of implementation tools.
Yeah,
it was starting, and so I was much more sympathetic to some of the most trenchant criticisms of the UN and the sort of UN skepticism that has been building up in many capitals, including in Washington. That being said, there is really no substitute for the UN General Assembly. As you know, in the sense that if the UN didn't exist, we would still need a venue where every sovereign independent country in the world had a seat at the table, had its voice heard, and was sort of a neutral meeting ground for all of that, right? So again, even if the UN in theory does still serve a purpose, but it's not obviously. And the kind of horror stories you hear from people who actually work at the UN, it's much worse, I think, than it's really kind of not an institution working the way it should be working.
Yeah.
On UN Security Council reform, we've been actually quite engaged on that issue. We held a workshop in New York a few years ago, last year, in fact, where we had members, again, most of the big countries represented there in an official gathering, and just to discuss what are steps for potential UN Security Council reform. And it stuck for a bunch of very bureaucratic reasons having to do with the Charter of the United Nations and how difficult it is to amend that charter.
Yeah.
And essentially, what India is part of a group called the G4, which are 4 countries that are aspiring for UN Security Council permanent membership. That's India, Brazil, Germany, and Japan. Mm. And they coordinate quite closely amongst themselves. They said we would like all 4 of us to become permanent members, along with 2 African countries. Okay. But it's up to the African countries to determine which 2 African countries.